Mom! They're everywhere! I slammed the brake down hard and the car shuddered to a halt. In the seat behind me, my son Luke and his best friend Clyde shrugged off their seatbelts and scrambled forward to get a better look. "Ha, brilliant," said Clyde. "Now what are we supposed to do, Sarah Jane?" "Isn't it obvious?" I said, letting the engine die. "We get Rani out of there." "But how, Mum?" Luke asked, his voice wavering with fear. "We'll never get past them." "Especially with him in tow," Clyde added, glaring at the old man who sat dumbstruck in the passenger seat. At that precise moment, I have to admit, I was open to ideas. One thing was certain, we had to act quickly. Bannerman Road was under attack. The Sarah Jane Adventures, Wraith World, by Cavan Scott and Mark Wright, read by Elisabeth Sladen. It's hard to believe that just that morning I had been standing with Rani outside an innocent-looking, if rather shabby, townhouse in Highgate. Rani had been staying with me while her parents were away visiting relatives in Danemouth and had been a nervous wreck all morning. Her hand shook slightly as she raised it to the brass doorbell. She paused, her hand hovering over the button. I couldn't help but smile. Rani Chandra was a girl who knew what she wanted and would usually charge right in to get it. At times, it was like looking in a mirror. I was just like her at 15. The ambition, the daring, the barefaced cheek. But I also remembered the doubts and fears, all part of growing up, and in this case, completely understandable. It isn't every day that you meet your hero. "Go on," I said, smiling encouragingly. Rani flashed me a nervous grin, took a deep breath and jabbed at the button. Somewhere within the old Victorian house we heard a muffled chime. Instantly Rani straightened and smoothed down her hair. She looked like a confident young journalist, despite chewing nervously on her lip every now and then. Through the patterned glass of the door we saw a figure shuffling towards us. "Ready?" I asked. She swallowed and nodded. After what seemed like an eternity of turned locks and thrown bolts, the heavy door creaked open to reveal a stooped, old man. Gregory P. Wilkinson's brow was furrowed, his eyes intense and guarded. But as soon as he registered who we were, a warm smile thawed his cold features. "Rani," he exclaimed, "and Miss Smith, how delightful to see you. Apologies for taking so long. I'm not as sprightly as I once was. Please, come in." Rani didn't need much encouragement. "Well, thank you so much for the invite, Mr. Wilkinson," I said, following her into the hallway and stepping out of the way so the old man could close the door. "You must be very busy." "Not at all," he replied, gesturing towards a room across the hallway. "It's my pleasure. And please, it's Gregory. I never stand on ceremony, Miss Smith." "In that case," I said, "it's Sarah Jane." Gregory smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Quite so. Now, please make yourself at home." The living room was crammed with books. They were everywhere, piled upon the floor, lined up on creaking bookcases, and perched precariously on the arms of chairs. "You have to take me as I am, I'm afraid," Gregory apologized. "I don't get many visitors, so don't really see the point of clearing up. I know where everything is, more or less." He waved a hand towards an old sofa draped in throws and blankets, and sat in his own worn chair beside the fireplace. I sat, pleasantly surprised at how comfy the sofa was, while Rani walked across the room to examine a framed picture. "Is that the original artwork for The Rise of Hankada?" she asked, awestruck. Gregory flashed me a conspiratorial smile. My, he said. "You do know your stuff." "Yes, my dear, it is indeed. From the first edition back in... Oh, when was it now?" 1973, Rani cut in, and then looked embarrassed for interrupting him. "Sorry," she added, finally taking a seat beside me. "Don't apologize," Gregory said with a chuckle. "It's wonderful to meet someone who's so interested in my little books." Little books, Rani exploded, forgetting everything I'd told her about being calm in an interview situation. They're brilliant. I've read every one of them twice, 3 times, and every time I find something new. Gregory raised his hands in mock modesty. Well, I must admit I'm always amazed that folk still read them. There are so many other distractions these days. The cinema, video games, and whatnot. I don't know, Gregory. There were plenty of people at your signing the other day, I said. Your Wraith World novels seem to have quite a following. The old author smiled. You flatter me, Sarah Jane, he said, a touch of melancholy in his voice. But we both know the numbers at the shop weren't anything to write home about. In days gone by, I may have attracted more, but who wants to come and see an old duffer like me these days? Rani had. She had been buzzing as soon as she'd seen the poster in the window of the bookshop. Author Gregory P. Wilkinson will be signing copies of The Fall of Hankada, the final novel in the Wraith World series, here on Monday, 13th September. What do you want to go to that for? Clyde had asked, genuinely puzzled as she'd bounded into the attic. Wraith World? Isn't that kids' stuff? No, she'd retorted, obviously annoyed at Clyde's dismissal. They're brilliant. He's brilliant. The worlds he creates are just so real, so believable. Yeah, wizards and warlocks, Clyde had smirked. They're real, all right. Rani hadn't let Clyde dampen her enthusiasm, and when Monday came around, we were at the front of the queue. I'd come along out of curiosity. I'd interviewed Wilkinson for Metropolitan magazine back in the 80s. I remember him being a serious man, obsessed with the fictional world he'd created. It's fair to say that his Wraith World stories had never worried the bestseller list, but he'd churned one out every few years and had built up quite a firm fan base. Then everything had gone quiet. People assumed he'd retired, until The Fall of Hankada had been announced last year, the final volume of the series and Wilkinson's swan song. He was right, of course. There weren't exactly queues down the high street, but there was a smattering of loyal readers, mostly men in their 30s who seemed to be enjoying the nostalgia of meeting a favourite childhood author. Wilkinson had feigned recognition when I introduced myself, although I could tell he didn't remember me. But he seemed to take an immediate shine to Rani, and when she asked if she could interview him for the school newspaper, he'd agreed immediately. Perhaps Miss Smith could bring you to my house in a couple of days, and you can interview me to your heart's content, he'd said. It would be a real exclusive. I'm not likely to talk to anyone else. He'd scribbled down his address on the back of a promotional postcard, and Rani had almost skipped out of the shop with happiness. And 2 days later, here we were in Wilkinson's cluttered living room, with Rani's reporter notebook and tape recorder ready for action. Oh, where are my manners? The old man suddenly said. I haven't even offered you a cup of tea. Please, I cut in, pushing myself from the soft sofa. Let me. I'm sure Rani is bursting with questions. Is the kitchen... Straight down the hall, Wilkinson said. Tea and coffees by the kettle. I made my exit, winking at Rani, who beamed back before turning her attention towards the old man. So, I heard her say, you say that Fall is your last novel? Gregory P. Wilkinson's kitchen was as ramshackle as his living room. I shivered slightly. Wilkinson seemed a nice enough guy and nowhere near as intense as the man I'd met 20 years ago, but his home was gloomy and neglected. Thick, stained net curtains blocked most of the light that struggled to shine through grimy windows, and a chill hung in the air. At least, I thought to myself as I approached the sink, he's done the washing up. 4 chintzy teacups sat upturned on the draining board beside a blue teapot. I filled the old-fashioned stove-top kettle, the water juddering in the pipes, and popped it on the gas hob before starting to search for matches or a lighter. I could hear Rani firing question after question at the old man, but as I scrabbled through doors and cupboards, I heard a noise. It seemed to be coming from behind the walls. Something thick, slow and sticky. Of course, it could just have been the rusty pipes of an old house, but there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, but there was nothing there. Could it have been a mouse? No. It had been red, blood red. Cautiously, I crouched down and peered around the corner of the kitchen unit. There it was again, darting out of sight, something scarlet and wet. What on earth was it? Swallowing, I reached for the small torch in my pocket when... Have you dropped something? I jumped to my feet and span round. Oh, Mr. Wilkinson, I exclaimed, catching my breath. I mean, Gregory, sorry. Yeah, I was looking for a lighter for the stove. I see, he said, his eyes narrowing. I'm afraid the kitchen is a bit of a mess, as I said. It's only me here. The earlier warmth drained from Wilkinson's gaunt features, grey eyes boring into me, and then his expression lightened again. I should have told you the matches are in here. He removed the lid from a ceramic jar on the work surface and handed me a box of oversized matches. Those should do it. Forcing a smile, I took the box, suddenly unsure about this strange old man and his creepy old house. Thank you, I said. I'll be in with the tea in a minute. Lovely, he said with a tight smile. He glanced at where I had been crouching, then turned and shuffled back to the lounge. Hello, geek girl, back from the wizard's lair? I'm ignoring you, Clyde, Rani said airily as we walked into the attic. We had a brilliant time and nothing you say'll spoil it. I'm glad you did, Clyde moaned, flopping back into his chair. It's been Dullsville round here. I thought you were going to play football, I remarked, dropping my bag down beside my computer. Oh, the computer on my desk, that is. Not Mr. Smith, the alien supercomputer I keep in the wall of the attic. So did I, Clyde whinged, but that was before Rani enrolled Luke into her nerdy book club. He's been like this for hours, Luke said from his beanbag perch in the corner. He didn't even look up from the book he had his nose buried in. I offered him one of your books, Rani, but he wasn't interested. Too right, Clyde countered. But that hasn't stopped Mr. Bookworm banging on about Wraith World this and Wraith World that. Mr. Bookworm has obviously got taste, Rani chipped in, still hugging to her chest the brown paper parcel she'd carried in with her. Stop bickering, you lot, I ordered with a smile. Are you enjoying the books, Luke? My son finally looked up, eyes bright with excitement. They're fantastic. Have you read them, Mum? One, I admitted, ignoring an exaggerated eye roll from Clyde's direction. A long time ago. I can't really remember much about it. Good, Clyde said firmly, because as I keep saying, they're kid stuff. Clyde, a wise man once told me that there's no point being grown up if you can't be childish once in a while, I said. Besides, there are lots of children's books you can enjoy, however old you are. Lewis, Tolkien, Rowling even. It's escapism. Clyde looked at me stonily. He wasn't convinced. There's this group of kids, Luke began, and they discover a portal between our universe and this hellish dimension. The Wraith World, Rani added. Right, and they team up with their teacher, Professor Bailey, to stop Hankada breaking through to our reality. Hankada? Doesn't he play for Spurs? Clyde asked cheekily. Rani glared. He's the gatekeeper of the Wraith World, a monstrous sorcerer who will stop at nothing to tear down the barrier between his world and ours. Why? Clyde asked. What's he want with us? Oh, the usual. Enslave the human race and pluck the meat from our bones, I answered, recalling the story I had read all those years ago. Not a bad story, if a little melodramatic. But it's not real, Clyde said, standing and folding his arms petulantly. That's what I don't get. After all the outrageous aliens we meet, and the real monsters we send packing, why waste time reading about made-up ones? There have been points this morning when Lukey boy has looked really frightened reading that rubbish. But we've done it for real. We've laughed in the face of the Uvodni, Sladen and Sontarans. Just shut up, Clyde! The attic fell quiet. We all turned to look at Rani, shocked at the violence of her outburst. She was standing there, visibly shaking and holding her package tighter than ever. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure rage, which quickly slipped into embarrassment as she realised how loudly she had shouted. "Oh, I'm sorry, Rani," I began. "Clyde was just teasing. There's no need to get upset." "Yeah," Clyde said. "Just having a bit of fun." "I'm sorry," Rani stammered. "It's been a long morning, meeting Gregory and then being given this." She raised the package. "What is it, Rani?" Luke asked, and Rani's dark mood lifted immediately. "Oh, you're going to love this," she said cheerfully. She placed the parcel on the desk and began unwrapping the brown paper. Even Clyde was intrigued. "Gregory gave it to me. I still can't believe it." I had been a little surprised myself. We were just about to leave when the old man had darted, more quickly than I would have thought possible, into his study. He had emerged carrying a small, thick book that looked as decrepit as him. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages inside were warped and yellowing. "My journal," he declared in a low, respectful voice, stroking its ravaged cover with a bony hand. "Found it in a little shop on the Charing Cross Road back in 1969. I'd been trying to write books for years, but never found the inspiration. When I first picked up this book, well, the ideas started flowing. I wrote them all down in here." "And these are your original notes for Wraith World?" Rani had asked, eyes wide with wonder. "It's all in here. Timelines, character profiles, my first sketches of Julian Bailey and Hankada." "Can I see?" Rani asked. But at first Wilkinson said nothing, holding her in a steady gaze, his eyes twinkling in the gloom of the hallway. "You can do more than that," he said, thrusting the journal forward. "It's yours." "He just handed it over?" Clyde asked. "I think he saw Rani as a kindred spirit," I said, feeling more than a little pride. "Now that he's finished writing his novels, Mr. Wilkinson wanted someone who really cares about his characters to have it." "That's so cool," cooed Luke. "Can I see his sketch of Hankada?" "Sure," said Rani, carefully opening the journal. Inside, each and every page was a jumble of scrawled notes, tiny illustrations and detailed maps. Whatever Clyde thought of Wilkinson's books, even he had to be impressed with this level of planning. Finally, she turned a page and revealed the hideous face of Hankada. It glared back at us with eyes that were tiny balls of infernal fire. Where a nose should have been, there was just a gaping hole, and beneath that, a jagged wound of a mouth. Even after all the terrifying things I've seen in my time, I could barely bring myself to look at the unnerving drawing. The monster's skin was made up of a writhing mass of red worms, weaving in and out of each other's slimy path. Blood-red worms. The same colour as the thing in Wilkinson's kitchen. "OK, I'll admit it," Clyde said, snapping me back to the here and now. "That's pretty impressive. The worms look like they're actually moving on the page." "Oh, that's not the best thing, though," Rani said, hardly able to contain herself. "Gregory admitted that The Fall of Hankada was never meant to be his last novel. There's another, but he's never finished the notes." "And the notes are in there?" Luke asked, eyes like saucers. "Not only that, but—" I began, then stopped myself. "Sorry, Rani should tell you. It's her news." Rani was almost bursting with excitement. "He wants me to see if I can finish it, if I can work out what happens next. He'll help me write it and send it to his publisher. I could take over the Wraith World series." "That's amazing," gasped Luke. Clyde didn't look convinced. "He's just handed his life's work to you on a plate." Mr. Wilkinson was seriously impressed by our Rani, I said, gently poking Clyde in the chest. It's a fantastic opportunity. You should be proud of her. I am, Clyde said, frantically backpedaling. But there's got to be a catch. There's no catch, Rani snapped, a little too forcefully, I thought. She swept the journal into her arms. He just knows genius when he sees it. Oh, yeah, Clyde said. And what's the genius going to do now? I'm going to start writing, that's what. Sure you don't want to be back with your precious books? Luke gave Clyde the kind of look that he wouldn't even have understood a few years ago, let alone given himself. After Rani had headed over the road to start her great opus, I had shushed them out of the attic. I had deadlines to meet, and I'd had enough of their squabbling for one day. They'd headed straight for the empty playground. Mum's right, Luke said, sitting on the roundabout and gently nudging it along with his foot. You should be pleased for Rani. Clyde bounced his football on the ground. I am, he insisted, adding a hasty, honest, after being fixed by another of Luke's glares. You're getting too good at that, my young Padawan, Clyde observed, wagging a finger at Luke. Remember, I am the master of the hard stare. Yes, master, Luke teased. It's just that we'll never see Rani now, Clyde continued. She'll be locked away scribbling in that old book. And what happens if some real monsters turn up? Will she be able to drag herself away? Luke didn't have a chance to answer. The scream cut him dead. What was that? He cried out, leaping off the roundabout. Clyde was already off, running in the direction of the yell. There's only one way to find out, he called over his shoulder. They soon found a girl, who must have been around 18, thrashing and clawing at her hair in the shade of an old oak tree not far from the playground. Are you okay? Clyde asked as he ran up. Course I'm not, though, she snapped back, frantically raking her fingers through her long blonde locks. It's in my hair, isn't it? For a second, Clyde worried that Luke, who had run up behind him, was about to correct the girl's grammar, and was relieved when the only thing he asked was, Whoa, what's in your hair? A dirty great worm, innit? The girl replied. I was just lying here listening to me music and felt it crawl across my head. A worm, Clyde said disappointedly. Is that it? Isn't that enough, though? She retorted, her hands falling to rest on her hips. Anyway, what's it to you? Clyde raised his hands in surrender. Well, we just thought we could... He trailed off, his eyes widening. You just thought what? The girl shrieked. What are you, some kind of idiot? No wonder you screamed, Clyde said. Oh, what are you talking about now? The girl shot back. That's the freakiest worm I've ever seen. The girl froze. Where? She squeaked, petrified. Where is it? Gingerly, Luke pointed at her shoulder, and the girl looked down, eyes wide with terror. A worm undulated slowly as it crept across the shoulder of her T-shirt. It was huge, fat, bloated and bright red, sopping with thick scarlet slime. The girl's scream was shriller than ever as she brushed it away, stamping on it as soon as it hit the ground. Don't! Luke cried out. You might hurt it. Why should I care? The girl blurted out. You want it, you keep it, freak! And with that she swept up her jacket and marched off, obsessively wiping the gunk from her T-shirt. The boys dropped to their knees and peered at the half-crushed invertebrate. Globs of orange, viscous liquid were oozing from where the girl's trainer had done the most damage. What do you think it is? Clyde whispered, as if afraid to disturb the creature. I don't know, admitted Luke. But I don't think it's from Earth. It's like no species I've ever seen. Worms from outer space? Clyde said, impressed. But what's it doing here, other than bleeding? Luke shrugged. Do you think it can hear us? He said. It might be intelligent. Not intelligent enough to stay away from the innit girl back there, Clyde replied. Perhaps we should take it back to Sarah Jane. Good idea. Have you got anything to pick it up with? Luke asked. Clyde gave him a look. No, I left my alien worm gloves at home. Besides, I don't think it's going anywhere. It looks pretty dead to me. Sure enough, the worm had stopped moving. "Imagine if it was the ambassador for an entire race of brainy space worms," Clyde said, oblivious to the fact that Luke was rising slowly to his feet. "We come in peace." "No, don't squish us beneath your foot. Oh, whoa!"
"Clyde," Luke said quietly, "that was one small step for a worm, one dirty, great stomping heel for mankind."
"Clyde!"
Luke repeated more firmly. "OK," Clyde said, getting back to his knees. "What we need is some sort of container."
"It'll have to be a big container," Luke said.
"Don't be silly," Clyde said, pushing himself to his feet. "I know it's a bit supersized, but it's not exactly." His mouth fell slack as he followed Luke's gaze to the oak tree.
"There's more of them,"
Luke whispered. The bark of the tree was splintering as hundreds of bright red worms began to push themselves out. They slipped and slid down the trunk, some tumbling, some crawling. Clyde cried out as one of the creatures fell onto his shoulder. He brushed it away, and the curled-up worm fell to the ground. Clyde looked up in disgust. The things were raining down on them, tumbling from the branches. Luke stood behind him, raising his arms to protect his face from the sludgy downpour of soft, wet bodies. "Run!" Clyde shouted. Luke didn't need any encouragement. Sitting in the attic, absorbed in the computer screen, I ignored my mobile when it first rang. My writing was going well, and I didn't want any interruptions. I half considered turning the phone off until I saw Luke's name flashing on the screen. "Hi, Luke, are you—"
"Mum, you've got to help."
Luke sounded panicked, breathing heavily on the other end of the phone. I was out of my chair in a shot. "Where are you? What's happened?"
"We're at the park,"
he yelled back.
"and they're everywhere."
"What are?" I asked, already pulling on my jacket. "What is everywhere?"
"Worms,"
he shouted.
"Alien worms."
"She's on her way!" Luke shouted across to Clyde, who, like him, had clambered to the top of the playground's climbing frame. Beneath them, a sea of the red creatures boiled and rippled, the early autumn sun glinting off their slick skin. "Good!" Clyde shouted back, never taking his eyes off the worms that had begun to scale the frame's chipped paintwork. "'Cause they're coming up after us!" "It's just like in the book," Luke said, inching closer to Clyde so that they were shoulder to shoulder. "What is?" Clyde asked, swallowing hard. The worms were almost halfway up the frame by now. "And Carter's worm hordes." "Is what?" "Worm hordes. They do his bidding," Luke explained, following people, squeezing under doors. "Oozing out of trees and coming up from the ground?" Clyde asked. "Something like that," Luke confirmed. "Well, this isn't a book," Clyde pointed out. "Those things look real enough to me. What do they want?" "Us," Luke said unhelpfully, before pointing to a spot where the seesaw had once stood. Now it was a heaving mass of red. "Look!" Clyde forced himself to look up from the advancing creatures and tried to think of something clever to say about what he saw. He couldn't think of anything, and so decided just to gape instead. Before their eyes, the worms surged upwards and began to slip and slide into the form of a giant figure, massive muscular arms bulging beneath wide shoulders. Huge horns sprouted from the newly formed head that was rising to face them. The same mouth that we'd seen in Rani's journal sneered as the piercing, fiery eyes fixed them with a withering stare. "That's not possible," Luke stammered, holding onto the climbing frame so tightly his knuckles bleached white. That's... His voice faltered. "And Carter?" whispered Clyde, completing the sentence. It seemed impossible, but the villain in Rani's books, the fictional villain, was now towering over them, made up of thousands of the thrashing creatures.
"So, Clyde Langer,"
and Carter hissed.
"Still think this is kids' stuff?"
I ran all the way down Bannerman Road to the park. Facing off countless alien invasions keeps you fit, but I was still gasping for breath as I sprinted into the park and headed straight for the playground. "Luke!" I shouted worriedly. "Clyde!" Mum! I was relieved to hear Luke answer as I clambered up a grass verge, only to stop dead as I found myself looking down at the playground. Luke and Clyde clung desperately to the climbing frame, a carpet of worms wriggling beneath them. But it was the dark figure standing before them that had me reaching into a pocket for my sonic lipstick as I leapt down the other side of the verge. "Leave them alone!" I shouted defiantly, pointing the lipstick at the nightmare creature. The figure's head squirmed as it slowly turned towards me, eyes like red-hot coals. "That's impossible," I breathed.
Hello, Sarah Jane Smith.
Hankada whispered, worms plopping onto the floor from the hand that extended towards me. The mouth twisted into a mocking smile, and a laugh, like somebody gargling with porridge, erupted around the playground. Luke and Clyde jumped down from the climbing frame, straight into the heaving mass of worms. "Get away from my mum!" Luke shouted. "Yeah, you heard?" Clyde joined in, picking up his discarded football and flinging it at Hankada. With a sickening squelch, it stuck to the monster's back and was sucked inside the seething skin. And then Hankada roared, an inhuman bellow that echoed around the park, causing my head to spin as I readied myself for attack. It never came. One minute the creature was rearing up before me, and the next it simply collapsed into itself, thousands of worms bursting into fine red powder as they hit the ground. Clyde's football bounced 3 times on the tarmac before rolling off to rest by the fence. "Does somebody want to tell me what just happened?" Clyde asked, looking around warily. "Luke?" I asked, placing a worried arm around his shoulders. "Are you all right?" It was Hankada. He wouldn't take his eyes from the spot where seconds before the creature had stood. He was real. "But how does that work?" Clyde agreed. "How does a picture from Rani's journal thing come to life?" The 3 of us looked at each other. "Rani!" we cried at the same time. Everything looked normal on Bannerman Road as we ran up to the Chandras' front door, but I couldn't shake this feeling of dread that had gripped me since we left the park. I glanced at the boys before knocking. A few seconds later, Rani opened the door. "Hi," she said coolly. She looked as if she'd just been woken from a nap. "Rani, are you all right?" I asked. She didn't get a chance to answer. "We saw Hankada," Luke blurted out. "He was real." "What?" In a split second, Rani's expression flicked from shocked to scared. If I didn't know better, I would have said there was even a little amusement in there too. "Rani," I said, stepping forward to enter the house, "I need to have a look at Wilkinson's journal." Rani folded her arms defensively. "It's my journal!" "Oh, yes, of course, your journal." "I'm really busy," Rani said tersely, moving to shut the door. This wasn't like her. I put a hand out and flashed my best journalist smile. "Please, it'll only take a minute." We filed into the living room, where it looked like Rani had been working. Wilkinson's frayed journal was open upon the dining table, a pen sitting across its pages. "There it is," Rani said. "You've seen it now." I stepped towards the table, but Rani quickly closed the book. She placed a hand protectively over the cover. Luke and Clyde gave each other an odd look as Rani absently stroked the front of the book. "Could I have a look inside?" I asked uncertainly, and Rani looked embarrassed. "I was doing what you said," she said, "trying to finish the story. It'll be rubbish. I don't want anybody to read it." "I bet it's brilliant," Luke said encouragingly. Rani smiled at him, taking her hand off the journal for a second, and I saw my chance. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I had no choice. I pulled the journal towards me and stepped quickly away, flicking open the worn pages. "Sarah Jane!" Rani snapped. "I'm sorry, Rani," I tried to reassure her, "but I need to see that picture again." "Seriously, it was mad," Clyde chipped in. "You should have seen it. Lukey boy was terrified." Luke looked uncertain, but managed to say, "So were you?" "Course I was," Clyde happily agreed. "It was made of giant worms, remember?" I flipped through the pages of Wilkinson's scrawled notes. "Give it back, Sarah Jane," snapped Rani so forcibly that Clyde jumped back with a surprised squeak as she stormed across the living room towards me. As I continued to search through the book, I noticed the handwriting suddenly changed from Wilkinson's scribble to something neater, more precise, Rani's handwriting. Rani wrenched it from my grasp, but not before I had seen familiar words on the last page. Luke, Clyde, Hankada, attacked. Rani crashed the book down on the table. "I think you'd better leave." "Rani, what's wrong?" Luke asked, his eyes full of worry. "Nothing's wrong. You made it happen, didn't you?" I interrupted. "You wrote the words in the journal, and then it happened." Rani looked at me and there were tears in her eyes. "I was angry with Clyde." "Whoa, what did I do?" Clyde asked. "You made fun of me, made fun of the books. You said they were childish." "Well," Clyde started, but I silenced him with a warning look. "Go on, Rani." "I wanted to teach him a lesson, so started writing in the journal about how Hankada appeared in the playground to scare him. It was just a bit of fun." Rani almost sobbed. "Just a story." "But the story became real," I said. Rani's eyes were wide with horror. "It's all right, it's not your fault," I said gently. "It's the journal. It has to be," Luke said. "Rani would never do that to us." "Let's go over the road. Mr. Smith can scan the journal," and Rani slammed a hand down on the book as I went to pick it up. "What are you doing?" demanded Clyde. "It's not me," Rani gasped. "I can't move my hand." The next second, Rani had snatched up her pen and, opening the journal, began scribbling furiously inside it. "Rani, stop writing," I said urgently. "I can't," Rani winced. "I'm trying to stop, but I can't." Luke grabbed Rani's pen hand and tried to pull it from the page, while Clyde attempted to yank the book away. But neither book nor hand would move. "Help me!" she pleaded desperately. I ran to the table, flipping open my scanner watch to examine the journal on a molecular level. But I stopped dead as I looked over Rani's shoulder. Her hand was a blur, but I could see words forming on the page. "And Hankada's worm horde surged through the house." Luke stepped back as Rani continued to write. "What's that noise?" he asked nervously. He was right. It was the same sound I'd heard in Wilkinson's kitchen. I glanced quickly around the room, but it seemed to be coming from, well, everywhere, and it was getting louder. "Rani, stop messing about. This isn't funny," Clyde demanded. "I'm not doing anything," she said through gritted teeth, her hands still a blur. "It's not Rani, it's the book," I told Clyde. I pulled out my sonic lipstick, the revolting sound growing even louder. "Hold on, I'm going to try something." Before I could point the sonic at the journal, Luke shouted a frightened, "Mum!" He was standing in front of the closed kitchen door, and it was bulging. Clyde ran to the other door. It too was creaking and straining as something pushed from the other side. Rani looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, tears running down her cheeks. I looked down at the pages of the journal, the pen still scratching away in Rani's hand. And Clyde stood before the heaving, straining doors, but it was too late. The worms! "Look, Clyde, get back!" I shouted. Both boys leapt back just in time, the doors ripping from their hinges as the wood splintered. Dark red worms exploded into the room, slapping against the walls and carpet. "Oh, not again," Clyde said, his nose wrinkling as he squelched over a wriggling mass. "These trainers are new." "We have to get out of here," Luke shouted over the noise, leaping across the room to me. "Rani, we're leaving, and you're coming with us," I said. But before I could reach her, a wall of worms rose up from the floor, blocking my way. I could see more of the creatures squeezing from beneath the carpet, and another barrier reared up, hissing angrily to stop Clyde reaching Rani from the other side. I heard Rani scream, but we were powerless to help as the mass kept growing, forcing us further away. "They're herding us!" Luke cried as Clyde collided with him. The three of us were forced back, the worms combining to form a red tidal wave that crashed towards us. As Clyde scrabbled furiously with the latch to the front door, I had one last glimpse of Rani looking at me with those terrified eyes, while her hand still scrawled in the pages of Wilkinson's journal. I stretched a hand towards her. "No!" I gasped. And then the wall of worms bucked, sending Luke, Clyde and myself flying through the door to land painfully in a heap on the driveway. Clyde scrambled quickly to his feet and ran at the still open door. "Come on then, worm boys!" he shouted defiantly, but the door slammed shut in his face, and he cannoned into it with a painful thud, ending up back on the path. "Are you all right?" I asked as Luke and I helped him to his feet. "Oh, don't worry about me. We've got to get Rani out of there." Clyde tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Luke hung back warily. He was white as a sheet. I placed my hands on his shoulders. "Hey, we're going to get Rani out of this, I promise." I tried to reassure him. "It's the stories," Luke said quietly, almost to himself. "They're becoming real." "We can get in this way," Clyde said, bounding round to the living room window. He put his face against the glass to peer through, and then jumped back as if given an electric shock. I didn't need to ask why. A tangled throng of scarlet worms pressed up against the window. They squeaked as they slimed across the glass, blocking the way in. "It's the same everywhere," said Luke, pointing up at the upstairs window, similarly covered by a nightmare curtain of red. "What are we going to do, Sarah Jane?" Clyde asked. "She's trapped in there, Mum," Luke said. I don't think I had ever seen him so scared. I took a deep breath. "I don't think we can help Rani right now." Clyde opened his mouth to protest, but I carried on. "But I think she's safe. The journal is the key to this. Whatever evil force is behind this, it won't hurt her. It seems to need her." "So what now?" Clyde asked. "We need to pay a visit to Gregory P. Wilkinson," I said, looking up at Rani's house, praying she would be safe. "I'd like to ask him where he gets his ideas." The door of Wilkinson's house creaked open as I placed a hand lightly against it. "Mr. Wilkinson?" My voice echoed along the dark hallway, but there was no reply. "Anybody home?" Clyde shouted boldly, barging past me into the house. He disappeared into the darkness. "Clyde!" I hissed after him. I glanced reassuringly at Luke. "Come on," I said. We found Clyde appraising the living room. "What a dump," he concluded. Even to its previous cluttered standards, the living room looked like a whirlwind had torn through it. The bookshelves were smashed, their contents shredded on the floor. The dining table lay upside down, fragments of shattered chairs around it, while the cushions from the dusty sofa were scattered to the four corners of the room. There was no sign of Wilkinson. "Mum, over here!" Luke was listening at the door leading to the kitchen. "Somebody's in there!" His brow creased. "They're crying." I opened the door carefully, and sure enough, we could hear somebody sobbing. Wilkinson sat on the floor in the dim shadows of the kitchen, his back to the wall. Tears shone through his eyes as he rocked backwards and forwards, as he clutched a crumpled piece of paper tightly in both hands. "I'm sorry, so sorry," he mumbled. "No choice. Too strong." "He's lost it," Clyde said. "Mr. Wilkinson," I said gently. "Gregory," but he just kept muttering and rocking. I eased the piece of paper from his hand. As it slipped from his shaking fingers, he looked up at us, his eyes deep pools of sadness. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. I smoothed out the piece of paper. It had been ripped from the journal and was covered in one word, repeated over and over. "Rani." "What have you done to our friend?" demanded Clyde. I didn't mean to do it, didn't mean to curse her, Wilkinson babbled. I knelt down beside him. What do you mean, Mr. Wilkinson? Rani's in great danger, and you're the only one who can help. The journal, the old writer continued. All those years ago it chose me. As soon as I held it in my hands in that musty old bookshop, I could hear it whispering to me, filling my head with ideas. After all those years of struggling, I had ideas. His eyes glazed over as he drifted away with his memories. I filled the journal with page after page of notes, writing day and night. Then, as the years passed, Hankada would come to me in my dreams, urging me to write more, to give him substance. No matter how much I wrote, there was always another empty page, hungry for words. I stopped sleeping, hoping the dreams would stop, but they didn't. I saw Hankada and his servants in the waking world. Wilkinson shuddered at the memory, and the room seemed to get colder. The old man forced himself to go on. He would stand over me, a hand on my shoulder, whispering the words I was to write. But he's just a character in a stupid book, Clyde said. Oh, he's real, Wilkinson replied. He looked straight at me. All he wants is form, Miss Smith, but I could never give it to him. I grew so old. And then Rani came along, I said. A tear ran down Wilkinson's cheek. She was different. Her mind so vibrant, so full of energy. So you gave her the journal. You gave her Hankada, I said, starting to lose my patience. No, Wilkinson sobbed. The book chose her like it chose me. I had no choice. After you left with the journal, Hankada appeared one last time. He said he had no more need for me. He said he was free. He ripped down my books, turned the house upside down. He began to rock back and forth again, going back to his trance-like state. I'm sorry, so sorry. This is getting us nowhere, Clyde said, pulling at my arm. He's balmy, and Rani's still in danger. You're right, Clyde, I said, folding the page of the journal and slipping it into my pocket. But we can't leave Wilkinson like this. We can't take him with us, Clyde protested, visibly wincing as I shot him a look. And we can't leave him here, Clyde. He's a sick old man, and he might still be able to help us. Mom, they're everywhere! Luke had good reason to be scared. I had slammed the brakes on just in time. If we had continued, we would have ploughed right into the rippling carpet of crimson that covered Bannerman Road. The worms were bubbling up from the drains, swarming across the street, smothering the walls and hedges. A sharp rap on the window made all four of us jump. It was a man wearing a uniform. I don't believe it, Clyde said from behind me. Someone called pest control. I lowered the window and turned to face the ashen-faced man. You better turn round, madam, he said, looking frazzled. There's no way you're getting through there. Goodness knows what those things are. I've never seen anything like it. Everyone's trapped in their houses. I've called it into the office and my manager's coming down to have a... The pest controller never completed his sentence. His mouth simply fell open and a lump of well-chewed gum tumbled to the ground. I followed his gaze to see mounds of worms growing in front of the car. Too many to count. What are they? The pest controllers stammered as they began to take form. Wraith warriors! Wilkinson gasped from the passenger seat beside me as an army of 6-foot figures reared up before us, tentacle-like arms flailing angrily. It was all the pest controller could take, and, as the warriors started to slide forward, he turned and ran screaming down the road. I was glad. One less soul to worry about. Now all I had to do was break through these monstrosities to get to Rani. Clyde seemed to know what I was thinking. It's all right, Sarah Jane, he said, swallowing hard. We'll create a distraction and you make a run for Rani's house. But I can't leave you, I began, but Luke cut me off. Clyde's right, Mum. It's the only way. We'll be fine. And if those things get too close, Clyde added, we'll take a leaf out of the pest controller's book and do one. I didn't like it. Abandoning the boys went against all my instincts. But Rani was in the middle of this and was in more danger than anyone. OK, I finally agreed, but no stupid risks. Distract them for a minute and then you get away, do you hear? Loud and clear, Clyde said, indicating for me to get out of the car so he and Luke could clamber out as well. In a shot, Clyde was out and running towards the far end of the road. Hey, spaghetti features, he yelled at the approaching creatures. Over here! As the faceless figures twisted towards Clyde, Luke ran after him, waving his arms frantically in the air. The Wraith warriors rasped and began to seethe towards the boys, breaking formation. It was working. I heard Clyde shout, "Come on, noodle doodles!" as I ducked down to look at the old man in the passenger seat. You stay here, Gregory, I began, but the car was empty. They're taller than I imagined, Wilkinson suddenly said from beside me, and can move much faster too. I need to get to Rani, I began, but the writer shushed me. And why is that? He asked. Because of me, Sarah Jane, because of what I did. Here you are, you and your boys, ready to fight hideous monsters to save your friend. It's the kind of heroism I used to write about, the kind that Rani obviously believes in. I let her down, and I'm not about to do it again. While I was pleased that seeing the consequences of his actions had shocked Wilkinson out of his near catatonic state, I didn't have time for this. Getting through the line of Wraith warriors would be hard enough on my own, let alone with Wilkinson in tow. Unless... Gregory, these Wraith warriors, you invented them. Oh, yes, I did. It was in the second book, The Evil of How were they defeated? I cut him off, trying to keep his mind focused. Defeated? Oh, well, it's a long time ago, but I believe Professor Bailey used the Trembler device to trigger a minor earthquake. The vibrations caused the warriors' bodies to break down into individual worms, which were then picked at by the crows. I was quite proud of that last bit, very atmospheric. Vibrations! I exclaimed, immediately reaching into my jacket pocket for the sonic lipstick. Come on! Clyde and Luke's distraction had opened up a gap in the line of Wraith warriors, and I ran straight for it, Wilkinson stumbling along beside me. One of the creatures slid towards us, whipping an oozing tentacle through the air. As Wilkinson gasped in terror, I adjusted the settings on the sonic lipstick and pointed it at the warrior. The lipstick activated with its familiar buzz, and immediately the grotesque figure shuddered, its body vibrating and thrashing. With an angry squelch, the Wraith warrior collapsed in on itself, and the ground was awash with a sea of crimson. Wilkinson stared at me in amazement. Earthquake? I shrugged, and then I was off, half sprinting, half sliding across the road and down the drive to the Chandra's house, Wilkinson huffing and puffing after me. I tried the front door handle and felt the door budge a little. I stepped back and gave the door a blast with the lipstick, then threw my entire weight at it. The door gave way, opening onto a thrashing wall of red. Right, I said firmly, twisting the head of the sonic lipstick. Time for some deworming. I fired into the heart of the twisting, tangled barricade. The worms shrieked as the disruption field hit them, shrinking back immediately. Sonic waves cut through the creatures like a hot knife through butter, and Wilkinson and I pushed forward. As we jumped into the living room, the wall of nematodes reformed behind us with a wet slap. We were trapped, but that didn't matter. We'd made it inside. What I saw stopped me dead. Rani sat at the table just as we'd left her, writing furiously in the journal. But it was the gruesome figure standing behind her that filled me with dread. A huge hand rested on Rani's shoulder. Hankada! Wilkinson gasped. Sarah Jane! Rani cried out, her eyes wide with terror. "Get away from her!" I shouted, brandishing the sonic lipstick. Hankada laughed that gargling, rasping laugh.
Too late, Sarah Jane Smith. She is mine. And her words are far more powerful than any sonic device.
1 second I was holding the lipstick. The next it had gone, but where? "I can't stop, Sarah Jane!" Rani's hand flashed across the page of the journal. "I can't stop writing what he tells me." "You're not real," I said desperately. "You're just a character in a book." "My book," Wilkinson added, drawing a sneer from Hankada.
The great writer,
the creature hissed.
"I didn't think I'd see you again. Are you staging a comeback? How amusing."
"I created you, Hankada," Wilkinson shouted, with more passion in his voice than I had ever heard. "And I can destroy you!" The old man rushed forward, hands outstretched, ready to grapple with the monstrosity before us. Hankada's vicious mouth stretched into a monstrous grin. As Wilkinson's gnarled hands grasped Hankada's throat, the creature's body blew apart into thousands of wriggling worms. With nothing to stop him, Wilkinson pitched forward with a cry, hitting his head against the sideboard. He groaned and lay still. Before I could get to him, a rasping laugh hung in the air, and with a violent whip-crack, Hankada reformed in front of me.
"Rani,"
he wheezed.
"I think it's time to write Sarah Jane Smith out of this story."
I looked at Rani. She looked at me. Her hand flashed across the page. Hankada's stomach-churning laughter filled the room. There was a flash, and I suddenly found myself standing in the attic of my own house on Bannerman Road. How had I got there? Was it Rani? Had she somehow written me from her house to here? If that was the case, if she could still influence the narrative, then perhaps Hankada's control wasn't absolute. But if we wanted to defeat him, we needed to know exactly what he was. "Mr. Smith, I need you," I said. The brick wall at the back of the attic split open in a blast of air and hydraulics. The wall lifted away to reveal the glowing screen and flashing controls of Mr. Smith, the best alien supercomputer in the entire universe. My alien supercomputer. "Hello, Sarah Jane." Mr. Smith's reassuring voice boomed around the attic. "How can I help you today?" "I need you to scan 36 Bannerman Road." "That is Rani's house, Sarah Jane," the computer replied. "Yes, I know," I snapped. "Just do it." "Scanning now." Mr. Smith emitted a series of beeps, the pattern on his screen shifting. "I am detecting a psionic field emanating from 36 Bannerman Road that covers the entire street. The field is warping reality around the house, and it is spreading." "Hankada is getting stronger," I said, my mind racing. "Sarah Jane, I have linked into the local CCTV network. I believe Luke and Clyde are in danger." The screen changed, showing an image of the street. The boys were backed against a wall, 4 of the Wraith warriors oozing towards them. "How can a book warp reality?" I asked, clenching my fists in frustration at the scene on the screen. "Psionics can be a powerful tool," Mr. Smith replied, "or weapon." He whirred and clicked as if thinking himself. "Would it be useful to know that I am detecting a secondary source of psionic interference?" "Of course it would," I said, exasperated. "Where?" "The back left pocket of your jeans." My hand flew to my back pocket. The scrap of paper I had taken from Wilkinson. I pulled it out and studied it. "Mr. Smith, I think this paper was ripped from Wilkinson's journal." Mr. Smith didn't wait for instructions and immediately began scanning. "The fragment is not paper in the traditional sense. Usually paper is produced from pressed cellulose pulp, such as wood or grass," Yes, Mr. Smith, I cut in impatiently, not needing a lecture. But what's this? It is a complex network of paramagnetic fibres, specially aligned to boost psionic energies and manipulate localized space-time to create an artificial reality dependent on the information inputted on the page. In other words, whatever Rani writes down comes to life. She can conjure up characters or even teleport me from one place to another. That's fantastic! But why do it? Why are stories ever written down, Sarah Jane? I don't know, I shrugged. To entertain? Precisely. Records show that the psionic paper originates from the planet Papyria in the Proxima Centauri system. It was used as a form of popular entertainment by the long-extinct Papyrians, a race of extremely powerful telepaths. And somehow, some of this psionic paper found its way to Earth. But what can we do to stop it? A thought struck me. Mr. Smith, this paper was ripped out of the journal. Is it still linked to the artificial reality? Indeed, it is a part of the psionic network. Then can you... I searched for the right word. Hack into it. I've got an idea. In the street below, Clyde and Luke are pinned against the wall, the Wraith warriors oozing over each other to get to the boys. Why did I think this was a good idea? Clyde whimpered. Because you've watched too many films, Luke offered, fighting back his fear. All around them the warriors raised their tentacles, which whipped and meshed together to form vicious-looking swords. Just when you thought today couldn't get any worse, Clyde said. Clyde and Luke closed their eyes tight, huddled together, waiting for the first blow to strike. It never came. Instead, Clyde heard a noise high above them, a raucous cry accompanied by the frantic flapping of wings. "Luke, look!" he shouted, opening his eyes. Luke gasped. The sky was black, teeming with huge crows. Suddenly, one of the birds swooped down from the heavens, its sharp beak wide open. Sarah Jane, it is working. I nodded at Mr. Smith, fighting back the temptation to look up from the keyboard to see if the boys were safe. One by one, the murder of crows attacked the Wraith warriors, I typed, plucking the worms from their bodies and pecking them apart. They screamed in pain, forgetting all about brave Luke and Clyde. It wasn't the best I'd ever written, but I had no time for a second draft. The important thing was that it was working. My words were becoming feathered, hungry flesh. Clyde whooped as the warriors cowered under a fresh onslaught of shrieking birds. The air was filled with the sound of flapping wings, harsh cries and ripping flesh. "What's happening?" Luke asked, and was answered by a relieved bear hug from Clyde. "No idea, but I bet it's got something to do with your mum." "This is no time to get writer's block," I yelled at the keyboard. Why was this so difficult? All I had to do was write Hankada out of existence.
Losing the plot, Sarah Jane.
A voice wheezed behind me. I span in my chair to see a whirlwind of red forming into Hankada, right here in the attic. The worms were swarming beneath the door and through a crack in the window. "What have you done with Rani?" I demanded, rising to face the colossus. Hankada gargled with derisive laughter.
She's working hard. I've given her a tight deadline, but I'm sure she'll rise to the challenge. She doesn't need someone trying to muscle in on the action. Especially someone with such bad syntax and sentence structure as you.
I know it won't win any awards, I snapped, but it does seem to be doing the trick. My early birds are catching your worms.
Is that so, Sarah Jane?
Hankada hissed.
But what if I instruct Rani to start a new chapter?
He pointed to the screen and my heart sank. Right, let's get out of here, Clyde said, grabbing Luke's arm. Those birds are getting a little too close for comfort. Luke didn't move. Oh, come on, let's go! No, Clyde, Luke said, holding his ground. Look! Clyde turned to see more Wraith warriors forming. The creatures turned their hideous faces to the sky and started to scream. Clyde and Luke covered their ears against the piercing war cry, but the crows above weren't so lucky. Startled by the sound, the birds took flight but didn't get far. One by one, they disintegrated, exploding into fragments of feathers and dust that vanished on the wind. Within seconds, the sky was clear, and the warriors turned back to Clyde and Luke. "I could get the RSPB onto you for that lot," Clyde shouted as they closed in.
What an exciting cliffhanger!
Hankada gurgled.
I wonder if the children will survive.
His face contorted into a twisted smile.
I doubt it.
"Let them go," I pleaded, my eyes flicking between the monster and the image of Luke and Clyde on the screen.
Where would be the drama in that, Sarah Jane?
Hankada replied.
Every good story needs jeopardy and excitement. Ronnie's imagination is a deep mine of both. You have served me well, Sarah Jane Smith.
"I have?" I asked, puzzled. "What have I done?"
You opened Ronnie's mind, showed her the wonders of the universe. For years, I have been trapped within the confines of Wilkinson's weak imagination. His fiction was as stilted as his body was frail. I could do nothing but watch myself fade away, left on the shelf for all eternity. But then he met Ronnie. That girl's got talent.
"So you used her," I cut in. "Used her imagination to give yourself form, to cause all this chaos. You have no right. You're just a character from a storybook, and every story comes to an end."
My story never ends, Sarah Jane. Not anymore. Those fools on Papyria thought they could control me. Create me for nothing, and then close the book when it suited them. But they just couldn't put it down. They lost themselves in their fantasies, and their civilization crumbled around them.
"So when they all died, you just stopped, your story unfinished, with no one to write the next chapter."
Until I found this planet and saw the potential of the human race. A whole new world, but I cannot risk the same thing happening again. This time Ronnie will rewrite the Earth in my image. This world will become the Wraith world.
"Sarah Jane," Mr. Smith interrupted. "Luke and Clyde are in imminent danger." I span and sobbed at what I saw. The boys were drowning in an ocean of worms on the road below, the warriors pushing them beneath the churning crush. "Please," I begged, turning back to Hankada. "There must be another way. Let them go." But Hankada wasn't listening. He had grown so large that his head was scraping against the ceiling, his body convulsing in rapture as his story unfolded.
This is a new chapter, Sarah Jane Smith,
he cried out.
My Wraith world incarnate.
I made for the door, but a writhing tentacle lashed out from Hankada and wrapped around me, growing tighter the more I struggled. I gagged as slimy creatures slithered over my body. Then suddenly, Hankada froze. The tentacle released me and I tumbled to the floor.
No!
Hankada shrieked.
Something is wrong. The narrative is failing.
I heard the sound of heavy feet on the steps outside the door. Was this one of Hankada's warriors come to finish the job? The door was flung open and a figure stumbled in, a figure carrying Rani in his arms. It was Gregory P. Wilkinson. Hankada whirled around and hissed at the old man.
You!
Sarah Jane, Wilkinson gasped. Help me! I ran to them and helped him lower Rani into a chair next to my desk. She looked so tired, and yet still managed to smile weakly at me.
I'm sorry I wasn't much help before, Sarah Jane, Wilkinson began, his voice sounding as weak as Rani looked, despite his bravado. Whacked the old noggin. Must have knocked some sense into me at last.
Impossible!
Hankada hissed.
How did you escape?
When I came to, Wilkinson continued, turning to face the monster, his hand never leaving Rani's shoulder. Sarah Jane was gone, and so were you. But something had changed. Your control over Rani was lessening, if I know you, Hankada. And I think that after all these years I do, you were too busy gloating, reveling in your brilliance. It's always been your fatal flaw. And with you distracted, Rani whispered, her voice cracking, Gregory managed to wrestle the journal from me. That's right, Wilkinson said, slamming the book down in front of Rani. This journal.
You are not needed here, old man,
Hankada screeched. But now it was my turn to face the creature, standing shoulder to shoulder with the author. You're wrong, Hankada, I said. Every great villain needs a hero. Without conflict, there is no story.
A hero!
Boomed Hankada, looming over us again.
I don't think so. A lonely has-been and a slip of a girl. Pathetic.
You're right, I said. A writer's life is a lonely one, sitting on your own, churning out page after page, pouring your heart and soul into every word. But you've missed one important thing. Hankada seemed to shrink back as Wilkinson's eyes caught mine. He nodded. Sarah Jane's right, Wilkinson said, leaning forward to open the journal. In Rani, you have given me a co-writer. Gregory's not alone anymore, I said, plucking a pen from my desk tidy and handing it to Rani, who took it with a shaking hand. Not now. I stood behind them, watching as Wilkinson leant over and gently wrapped his own shaking hand around Rani's. As if strengthened by his touch, her fingers closed around the pen and she began to write. They began to write. Outside, Clyde gasped for air as the wave of worms suddenly swept away, freeing them. Clyde, are you okay? Luke cried out as he broke the surface, wiping slime from his eyes. I'll never eat spag bol again, Clyde admitted. But yeah, where are they going? The boys looked around. Every worm on the street was flowing in one direction. The house! Luke cried out. They're heading towards Mum! Hankada's piercing scream filled the attic. In the midst of this cacophony, Wilkinson stood beside Rani, supporting her with one arm while the other moved in tandem with hers. And Hankada's horde returned to him, the old man yelled, reading out as they were writing, turning on their lord, attacking him from every angle. As he spoke, worms poured through the open doorway and tumbled through the window. But Hankada seemed to take strength from this, his nightmare form growing taller, that horrible, gargling laugh echoing around the attic. One by one, Rani shouted, picking up the story, they pushed him back into his own dimension, breaking his... Rani faltered, the words dying on her lips. Wilkinson slumped next to her. Hankada was fighting back.
You are weak,
he howled in triumph, rising up as if to swoop down and engulf Rani and Wilkinson. Sarah Jane, Rani said, her body sagging. I can't do it. Next to her, Wilkinson slumped against the table. I stepped forward decisively, placing my hand over Rani's and Wilkinson's. Yes, you can, I said. We can do this together. As our hands touched, I felt a tingle, as energy seemed to flow from me through Rani and Wilkinson and onto the page of the journal. Rani immediately sat upright,
and Wilkinson appeared to regain his strength as our hands began to move the pen together. Rani picked up the story again, her voice suddenly strong and confident. They pushed him back into his own dimension, breaking his hold on our universe. Cursing and screaming, Hankada was crushed by the incredible forces that exist between realities. By the light of Mr. Smith's display, more of the worms swarmed over Hankada, forcing him down into a swirling ball of red that contracted with every passing second.
No!
He screamed, now just a contorted mess of flapping tentacles at the centre of the shimmering heap.
This is not how it was written.
Until finally, I joined in, all that remained of the once powerful gatekeeper of the Wraith world was one lowly bloodworm, twisting and vulnerable on the attic floor. Behind me, Clyde and Luke crashed through the door. "Mum!" Luke called. "You're safe," I gasped as I ran to him and hugged him close, even though he was covered in gunk. "Both of you!" "Next time I say I'll be a diversion," Clyde said, wiping a hand through his own sludge-encrusted hair. "Shut me up, OK?" Then his eyes widened as he saw the one remaining worm wriggling across the floor. "I thought they'd all gone," he said warily. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Wilkinson. Without saying a word, the old man walked past us to stand directly over the solitary worm, which thrashed and cowered in his shadow. "What are you going to do?" Luke asked, stepping up behind him. "Bring this story to an end, once and for all." And with that, Wilkinson let go of the book. We watched as it tumbled from his hand, pages flapping, until it landed with a splattering thud on top of the work. "Yuck," Clyde complained, pulling a face. "That's disgusting." Beside him, Rani pitched forward in her chair. Luke rushed forward and caught her, steadying her in his arms. "Is it over?" she croaked. "Is Hankada?" I stepped beside Wilkinson and looked down at the journal. The writing on the faded pages was shifting, forming one last picture. From the paper, the image of Hankada snarled and screamed at us in silent fury. With the tip of my foot, I flipped the book shut, sealing him inside forever. "He's gone, Rani. Hankada's story is finished." My computer beeped to let me know I had received a new email. "Rani," I called out, "it's from Gregory." Rani smiled and got up from the beanbag, dropping her book back to the floor. It had been a month since Gregory had insisted we burn his old journal, and I was glad to see Rani reading. For a while I thought she'd never pick up a book again. "Oh, he's got it working then," she said as she looked over my shoulder. "What was that he said about old dogs and new tricks?" "How's his new place?" Clyde called, not looking up from the picture he was sketching in the light that streamed through the window. Beside him, Luke lay on his stomach, flicking through a comic. Life had returned to normal in the attic. Well, as normal as it ever gets. "He's loving it," Rani replied. "Lots of sea air and plenty of fish and chips." "And look," I said, pointing to the end of the message, "he's starting to write a new book." "Let me guess," said Clyde. "It's about a courageous trio of kids with a supercomputer in the attic, saving the world and fighting monsters." "Well, what about Mum?" Luke said defensively. "Oh, yeah," smirked Clyde. "I guess there'll be this woman who turns up to lend a hand sometimes." "Cheek," I said, shooting Clyde a look. "Well, Gregory doesn't say any of that," said Rani. "But he does say that this time there's no monsters and definitely no old journals. From now on, he's sticking to a laptop." "And what about you?" I asked, turning to face Rani. "Are you going to try your hand at storytelling again?" "Maybe one day," Rani said, a haunted look darkening her eyes just for a second. Then she broke into one of her dazzling smiles. "Besides, fact is much more exciting than fiction around here." The Sarah Jane Adventures, Wraith World, was written by Cavan Scott and Mark Wright and read by Elisabeth Sladen. It was produced by Neil Gardner.